G'day ladies and gents, and welcome back to War Thunder. Today we're going to be covering a nation that rarely gets featured on the channel, mainly because, yes that's right, it's the T2, the Japanese brand new top tier Mach 1.03 on the deck fighter. Now this particular plane seems to boast some really impressive stats. It's probably one of the best accelerating aircraft in the game. It has the highest top speed. It apparently can go 1700 kilometers per hour. I believe that's true airspeed at 10,000 meters, but you'll rarely see that, and I'll get to that in a little bit. It has been. Did I also mention it has two AIM-9E missiles, which can sustain, I think, 10 Gs, compared to the AIM-9Bs, which can only sustain 6, and the R3Ss, which can only sustain 4 or 5. This is a marked improvement from currently what we have in the game. And a lot of people have been arguing that it is overpowered, and it does seem like that on paper. It's extremely fast, it accelerates really well, it seems to turn extremely well as well. But one of the issues with the T2, and this is probably the reason why I personally don't like the plane, is that you have to apply such a rigid playstyle. Now, I know it has a high acceleration, and it has a really high top speed, which may give you the impression that it is a really good sort of dogfighter. I mean, it seems to have a really good AOA. It seems to turn, its first turn seems to be pretty solid. I mean, it does wobble a little bit, but a few things really let the plane down. So, as I mentioned previously in my speculations video, the plane has really stubby wings, and this means that it doesn't produce a lot of lift, especially at low speeds and high altitudes. And this is where its weakness lies. If you can get the plane into a turn fight, then you can really force the T2 to reveal its weaknesses. The T2, whilst being a very strong plane, still is killable. And in order to kill it, you have to force it to play aggressive. Now, how do I know this? It's because I play aggressively, and I die a lot in this thing. I believe I'm barely positive in the T2, mainly because I just try and play aggressively as possible, and end up losing just because it can't really sustain long dogfights and long drawn-out fights like that. Another balancing factor that we can mention is that the gun is pretty terrible. I mean, it's a Vulcan cannon. It has an insane rate of fire, but it just doesn't output the damage that some other guns do. And that, I think, is fine, considering the current balance of the game. The T2 is probably the undisputable best fighter in the whole game, but I think, personally, my favorite still lies with the G91YS, simply because it is able to be played more aggressively. The T2, and you can see me, I'm playing fairly aggressively here. I'm turning, I'm burning, I'm almost to the point of dogfighting with an F-35. I'm playing this thing really aggressively, and it doesn't really like it, honestly. It's not a plane that you can afford to play ruthlessly aggressively like the G91YS and still sort of turn out on top. And that is probably why I have voiced, I guess, a dissenting opinion, a negative opinion on the T2. I mean, it is still a fantastic plane, and it is still borderline overpowered, but I think the T2 is definitely not unkillable. And there are certainly ways to deal with T2s in battles in order to scrape a victory. Now, obviously this involves teamwork, and this involves coordination, and this is something that many teams and many people in online games simply just don't show, and that's part of the way online games work. There's nothing you can really do about it. You can see me there oofing an AIM-9E into the sea. Now, if that had been called out earlier, I may have not done that. Maybe someone would say, oh, he's going down, he's crit, and I can't see through that cloud, which I might add is another balancing factor. And you might say, well, the radar kind of compensates for that. Well, yes and no. You see, the radar tends to be really shaky. Maybe that's just for me, who's running on 300 ping, but the radar is extremely unreliable for me. It's really good for spotting people in clouds and really good for finding that last idiot at 10k in a night battle. And this is one of the things that I really enjoy about what Gaijin does, is they seem to have taken the feedback from myself and from others like Cathfor, for example, who made a really interesting detailed video on radar, and SPAA radar in particular, and how it's used in real life, and how that can be applied to the game versus helicopters. And I think that was really, really cool. And the fact that I think Gaijin actually takes a note out of our book, I suppose, I guess you can say it like that, and has a listen. And I think that's really, really cool. So I guess, if you think that the T2 isn't really great, or if you think it's overpowered or whatever, voice your opinion, play the game a little bit, spend some time fighting, maybe make a video on it, maybe make a forum post. And you can see there that F-100 managed to get a kill on the T2 because he baited that T2 nice and slow, but also managed to get the missile kill. So once the T2 is slightly damaged, especially in the engine, as is with all jets, you find that is a real limiting factor. And it happens to be the case with the T2 as well. You damage the engines even just slightly, it's going to have a hard time keeping up because this thing relies on its speed, and the moment you take away a little bit of engine power, it's pretty much gone. Now, in this dogfight here, you can see two things. You can see what I'm doing to get on this guy's tail and take him out. I'm sort of boom and zooming him in a sort of turn fight. I'm trying to take the turn fight vertical, and he's not doing it because he just doesn't have the energy to keep up. Now, what you should be doing is you should be working in 2v2s or 2v1s. Now, obviously, this isn't always possible, but this is the way that you fight jets that have better energy retention, but slightly less AOA, slightly less lift. What you do is you work together. One of them gets them slow, the other swoops in. And this is the same for the T2 as well. The T2 can do this, but kind of to a lesser extent. It's a little bit more independent. And this is probably why Gaijin's given the F-100 a slightly lower BR. I'm kind of excited to see an F-100 with a higher BR, like an F-100E or F-100H, if there's something like that, perhaps with more thrust and maybe more capabilities, that's able to rival the T2 in its combat capabilities. Another thing that is surprisingly weak with the the T2, is its fuel. It seems to burn through fuel quicker than the F-100, probably because it's got two engines and a lot less sort of storage area to store fuel. One of the things I'd like you to take note of is on the radar, you can see just forward of me, just off to my left there's an F-100, and in fact, there are two of them. Now, props to these guys. These guys are probably some of the most honorable people that I know, either because they didn't see me, they were too fixated on the other T2, or because they were just being gentlemen. Now, they could have strafed me, and that probably would have been the end of it. That T2 is low on ammo, fuel, and he wouldn't have survived much longer. That's another thing with the T2. It's got really low endurance. But aside from that, these F-100 pilots decided not to strafe me, and whilst that did give me the victory, they aren't acting like little babies, and that is really, really nice to know. It's really nice to have some people that aren't going to strafe you on the runway, and that honestly means a lot to me as a player who plays this game nearly every day. Someone who, regularly plays jets and finds strafing on the airfield to be one of the most frustrating things ever, although sometimes it is, a viable tactic. It's not against the license agreement or whatever. It's still a little bit frustrating, but props to these F-100s for actually putting up a real fight. And you can see that they somewhat do, although to the end, a little bit less, but at least they don't strafe me on the runway here, and I really, really appreciate that. So, back to the T2. I managed to get off the ground, and now I'm going to help this friendly T2. It's a really, really interesting plane, the T2. The Vulcan cannon is probably the biggest thing that lets it down. It's one of those planes that has amazing performance and a terrible gun. Although the Vulcan cannon does have really good range, and it does have a really good rate of fire, it just doesn't quite have the damage. Now, fast forward a little bit, and I'm trying to get I don't even know what that was, man. That missile? What's going on? But this is a really interesting dogfight. So you can see that this guy has sort of put himself in front of my guns a couple of times. And I'm trying to keep my turns simple. I'm not floundering around like this guy. I'm keeping them short. I'm keeping them accurate. And I'm trying to, if I know I'm not going to be able to turn into him, like in this situation right here, as he's going for a corkscrew, I boom and zoom away from him. And that's a really, really strong tactic for a plane like the MiG-19. I used to use that in the MiG-19, and I probably still will this patch. Now this guy realizes that all is lost, and he goes for the deck. There's really not much he can do now. He's had his chance and he blew it because he's just running at the moment, and he's not really able to do a whole lot because I just have taken the advantage from him. And now that's not to go to say that the T2 is a vastly superior plane. It is still superior, but not to the point where the F-100 couldn't have salvaged that. I think if he'd pushed the plane a little bit harder, he's got some good flaps, he's got some good lift that he can pull out. I think he could have done it, but he just wasn't tightening his turns well enough, and he wasn't playing it smart. Now, obviously, he's the last one left. The F-100 crashed while trying to land, and that's one of the problems with the F-100. It's just not fuel efficient enough, I suppose. You need to take a large fuel load, and this guy obviously has. Now, I've been chasing this guy down, and I've got my radar lock on him. This is not going to do anything for now, just because he's a little bit too far from me. And you can see, all it really does is give me a little indicator, not much more than what the F-100's marker would have given. But you can still see the vector, and that's kind of cool, and it gives you a little bit more information, which is really crucial at top tier. So I'm basically just trying to get some shots onto him. I get a lucky shot because of the lead indicator. And the lead indicator from the radar is really, really helpful below 1,000 meters. And there we go. That's enough critical damage to get him down. And that's the T2. That's a nice 4-kill game. Pretty solid result. And good teamwork, good sportsmanship overall. Now, obviously, he did drag me over his airfield, but still, there wasn't a whole lot that he could do. And whilst the T2 is really strong, and whilst the T2 is not invincible, I still think it is, without a doubt, the best jet in the game, although not tier for tier. I think that would go to the G91YS, and that explains the title of my earlier video. The T2 could probably go to 10.3, and I would suggest that it does go to 10.3 for balancing reasons, simply because at 10.0, you're going to fight Sabres, you're going to fight the premium ones, the F-35, stuff that doesn't have missiles, and you need missiles to deal with the T2, as I said in my previous video. So I think, whilst the T2 is a really good plane, it's not unkillable, but it is a little bit overpowered. I think it could go to 10.3, and there we would have a nice little balance. Anyway, ladies and gents, take care, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time. If you watch to the end of the video, type T-gay. Later, guys.